Today, Secretary of Defense General James Mattis was asked if the U.S. response to the chemical weapons attack in Syria could lead to a confrontation with Russia.
At what point is there a danger of this spiraling out of control and the conflict between two nuclear-powered countries?
It will not spiral out of control. As you know, Secretary of State Tillerson is in Moscow. We maintain communications with the Russian military and with the diplomatic channels. I'm confident the Russians will act in their own best interest, and there's nothing in their best interest to say they want this situation to go out of control.
In addition to the situation with Russia and Syria, the White House is also facing a threat from North Korea, which today warned of a nuclear attack on the United States. At any sign of United States aggression, a U.S. Navy strike group is now on its way toward the Korean Peninsula. And this is what President Trump tweeted this morning. I explained to the president of China that a trade deal with the U.S. will be far better for them if they solve the North Korean problem. So there is the president of the United States saying, according to his own logic on international trade, that he will sacrifice American jobs to China in negotiations with the Chinese if the Chinese can help with North Korea. Donald Trump, according to his own economic principles, would be paying a jobs ransom to China and North Korea in order to reduce North Korea's threatening posture in the world. Joining us now, John McLaughlin, former acting director of the CIA. John, I want to go through a bunch of things, starting with what we were just talking about, which is the president's most recent meeting with the president of China, and now saying publicly today that he will introduce trade discussions with China while trying to talk to China about North Korea, trying to persuade China on North Korea. Is that how you conduct a negotiation like that?
I don't think that's the right way to deal with China. China does not respond well to anything that feels like a threat or sounds like a threat. It doesn't mean that we don't be firm with them. They, of course, are both a partner and an adversary at times, but that is not the way to go about it. We will need Chinese assistance in anything that we attempt to do to reduce the North Korean threat. As many people have noted, 90% of North Korea's trade comes from China. China bails out North Korea on things like food and energy. And on trade, I think the president has a steep hill to climb here, because by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership actually on his very first day in office, he has essentially ceded the field to China in Asia. And this is what I hear from most of our allies who have large proportions of their trade with China. Take Australia, for example. About 30% of its trade is with China. Other countries are in the range of 19%, 25%. And the pullback by the United States leaves them feeling like they're going to get sucked into China's economic orbit. So the president has a lot of work to do with China on trade, and he will need their help on North Korea.
The first question I asked about the sarin gas attack has become the question of the day now, which is, did Vladimir Putin know about the attack before it occurred? We don't have definitive information on that, but knowing the relationship as you do between Vladimir Putin and Assad, is it conceivable that Assad would have used chemical weapons, knowing that they'd be exposed immediately as soon as he used them, and knowing that, in effect, Putin would be exposed as not having actually gotten rid of those weapons the way he had promised to, that would all occur without Vladimir Putin knowing it?
I don't think that Assad would be so clever as to put that all together into a package. But what I do have some confidence in is, given the long relationship and the deep involvement that Russia has in Syria, and the interweaving of their forces with Syrian forces, both the Air Force and the conventional forces, I'm pretty confident that Russia would certainly know they still had chemical weapons. I don't have a view on whether Russia knew in advance that they were going to use them. I find that a bit of a stretch.
Quickly, Secretary Tillerson said today, here he is about to start discussions with Russia today, and he said, why should U.S. taxpayers be interested in Ukraine? Could you give him an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I see, when you're thinking about Russian policy and the threat it presents, I see Ukraine as kind of the canary in the mine shaft. In other words, watch Ukraine very closely. I was in Ukraine back in October, and a parliamentarian there said something to me that I thought was very revealing. She said that Ukraine is the only country among the former countries of the Soviet Union that can actually change Russia. And what she meant by that was, if we in Ukraine succeed in moving closer to the West, closer to the EU, closer to the United States, if we have a pluralistic, democratic society here, a prosperous one, which particularly the younger people in Ukraine are striving to achieve, this will be a threat to Putin, because Russians tend to look at Ukraine as their little brothers, little sisters, and given that they put up with an autocratic government, the absence of a free press, and a political contract that says basically stay out of politics and you can have a nice life, if they saw a much different situation in neighboring Ukraine, actually the heartland of the Slavic nation, this would be a threat to Putin. And so that's why I think he is insisting on establishing his presence in eastern Ukraine, encouraging autonomy there. It's why he went into Crimea. For him, one of the biggest threats on his horizon is that Ukraine succeeds. So in a way, just to finish this comment, maybe the most important thing we can do if we want to put a crimp in Putin's style is to help Ukraine succeed, because it would drive him crazy.
John McLaughlin, let's hope you can get that message to Rex Tillerson. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.